Got it. Somehow it's appropriate that the recording is a recording of silence. The doors of perception could be cleansed. We would see the world as it is, infinite. William Blake. The doors of perception could be cleansed. We'd see existence as it is, infinite, without boundaries. Not bounded by our emotional reactions or our mental constructs. We see as through a glass darkly, as it's said in the Bible. We visited this last week. But really, this question is worthy of revisiting on a daily, if not hourly basis. To what extent are we living in unblemished true perceptions or in emotionally charged mental projections we mistake for reality? And as the Buddha said, as he pointed out, in mistaking our emotional reactions and mental formations for reality is how we continue life after life in samsara. There's the two obscurations, right? The two kinds of obscurations. The conflicting emotions, the poisons, grasping, aversion, and whatever, indifference, not caring. But then there's also all of those mental obscurations, 40,000 of them. Somebody back in the day working on the Abhidharma, somebody counted them, I guess. But we may not know exactly how many, but we know very well there's a lot of ways to get lost in thought. Or not. So the Buddha spoke of two paths, one of which is the path of sentient beings governed by the law of karma, and the other one's a noble path, not governed by the law of karma, but as the poet says, a freshness in the center of the chest, like a spring overflowing its spring box. Not fixed, contentless, which is to say, open or empty. Empty in the sense of space, though, a fullness that holds anything and everything. So these two paths, governed by two truths, the relative one, where everything we recognize to be interdependent relative to everything else. So this is really the basis in Buddha Dharma, is getting clear that things, including us, do not exist as independent entities cut off from one another. That we are inextricably interrelated with everything. And of course, one of the great graces of the Dharma is that it's really not a religion as much as it's a science, a contemplative science. Right? So we don't worry about believing anything or disbelieving anything. We look into it and discover what's true and what isn't. I mean, even calling Buddhism Buddhism is a new thing, right? It began with the colonizers going to Asia. They discovered the Dharma because in Asia, before the Europeans came over, there was the Dharma. In Japan, it was called Zen. And there's that wonderful slogan from I think it's the 14th century in the Lojong teachings that began with Atisha in the 11th century. He brought him to Tibet. And then later on, some slogans were conceived. And there's one there that says, all dharmas agree on one point. It doesn't say all the schools of Buddhism. Well, eventually, of course, they split it into a few different schools. But that's normal. That's traditional. Right? When the Buddha died after his parinirvana, the Dharma splintered into 18 schools, not just one. I thought about this for some time, that one of those schools The Pugalas believed in a self, but we don't know about them anymore. Most of the schools we don't know about anymore. But it's made me wonder the way we use self today. We use sometimes it with a capital S. People will use self to refer to something beyond the self. So I wonder about that. But they were arguing 18 different schools. And then in Tibet, there were several different schools. There were 2 in China, at least 2 in Japan. The 2 in China are very interesting because there's the traditional progressive Chan, dhyana. It's a translation of the Sanskrit word dhyana, it means like contemplation. And then there was a sudden school. So really, these 2 schools reflect the 2 truths and the 2 paths. One relative and gradual, and the other right now, open, undefended, unconstructing. Which is the point and the goal of the gradual path anyway. So in a point of inquiry, perception, there are those 3 parts. There's the object of perception, the door, the sense door, and then the cognition or the perceiver of that perception. So to cleanse the doors of perception, what does that mean? You could say that it means to stop clouding them up. Stop engaging in obscurations. The emotional, conflicting emotions, as well as the mental constructs. So last week, somebody raised a question, wanted some clarification about the difference between Dharma and Dharmas. So we know that Dharma is the teaching. We could say all the teachings of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas and the enlightened ones. The Dharmas are phenomena. Dharmas are regular objects of perception. So when we talk about perception in Buddhist psychology, there's always this uh, mediation through these sense doors. There's so many dharmas. And so the way that it's talked about is there is the object and the perception of the object. It's called ayatanas. And then the field of awareness within which they take place, which is called dhatu. It's like means like dimension. So sight has its own dimension, taste has its own dimension, thought has its own dimension. There are all these dhatus, and they're all different. But the thing about the dharmas is that they all have the same nature. The word that's often used is dharmata, suchness, which is related to this perceiver point. That the reality that we perceive is contingent upon how we're perceiving, what's of interest to us, what concerns us, what we like, what we don't like, and everything else. Dharmata is free of all of that. There's no intermediary between us and what we're experiencing. The doors of perception, there's nothing clouding the doors of perception. When that happens, that's the absolute truth in distinction from the relative truth. So the point of the Dharma is really twofold. There's an everyday truth relative to our karmic vision. And then there's an absolute truth that's free of all that, unconstructed. So to be less carried away by the relative stuff, we want to become, in a certain sense, a better person, a more virtuous person, a less upset, a less upsettable, less agitated, withdrawing our projections. This is a kind of a project that's common to many religions. Moral integrity. But there's also this point, this absolute truth. That's really a distinguishing feature of the Dharma. Enlightenment, potentiality of enlightenment is the distinguishing feature. but it's a kind of a big word, enlightenment, awakening. So this is where it becomes mission critical to discover what that actually is, to prepare ourselves for seeing that. And then recognizing it when we see it. Like looking into the perceiver. So that's like the experiment. Looking into the perceiver, what do you perceive? Finding that maybe there's no thing to perceive. To what extent can you bear it? The title of Kundera's book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. You didn't have to explain it. We all know, we all get an intuitive sense of that. Being open, groundless. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about that. So I'm interested in how this strikes you, what makes sense, what doesn't, what you notice when we did that little exercise looking into the looker.
So, Ken, thank you so much. The exercise of looking into the looker was awesome, and part of that. What's the title of this your talk tonight? Remind me.
The doors of perception.
Yeah.
But it's really sort of, what is reality? Part
Yeah,
two.
that's it. Yeah. So sometimes I struggle with. Uh, so I feel like I'm in like the zone, and I'm focusing on the breath, and really, mind's not wandering that much, and magic happens. And I wonder if it's like how much is fantasy and how much is like being more tuned into the way things really are. Um, so that's one thought that came up with the looking into the looker, and a kind of a visual fantasy. I've been, it's been winter. I've been starting a lot of fires, having a lot of fires at home, and when the fire is the logs just kind of smoldering. It kind of feels like when I'm, the thinking mind and not really being in tune to uh, looking at the looker. And then with just a couple little breaths, that log just sparks up and it's on fire, it's burning really brightly. And that's kind of when I'm feeling tune and looking into the looker, it's on fire. And when I'm not, it's just kind of smoldering along.
Well said, Robert. That's how it is. That's how it is in general, and especially early on. That moments of indelible presence. Because if there's when at the point where there's a question, is it this or is it that? We're already out of it.
Yeah.
And so a moment, an instant, an indivisible instant of presence. In the Dharma, we want to recognize that spark. And in recognizing that spark, that is already the fruition. This is a point that is not clear until you get into something like Dzogchen or Mahamudra. Because normally it seems like, oh, nirvana, enlightenment, wow, that's like down the road somewhere, and it's probably fabulous, right? It's going to be, fireworks are going to go off and everything. That's how we imagine it when we're not present. So, in the service of science, contemplative science, rather than religion with all of its stages and steps and many skillful means and so on and so forth, it's a moment of indelible presence, such as you say in the zone. It's a moment of recognition. That's the point. You've already arrived. And so then we want to relax. And it'll pass. It'll pass because we don't have stability. In relaxing into groundlessness. So that's why I'm liking to use a lot of different vocabulary to talk about shunyata, emptiness. Gets translated as emptiness. I usually translate it as openness, but also we could talk about groundlessness. Groundless, boundless, has no height, has no depth, has no here, has no there. Immediate perception, unelaborated by a single concept, by a single thought. When the thought starts happening, now we're in thoughts. So this is really important. And so much of the Dharma is about pointing out how we get lost in thoughts, lost in objectifications. So there's objects of perception, but objects of perception can only be maintained if there's a subject observing them. And because we have such propensity to get caught up in poisons and in narratives, stories of me. Oh, we have such 24/7. We have narration project going, talking about our life to ourselves, and then also talking to other people as well. This is another word for samsara. Compulsive thinking. Eckhart Tolle talks about it as compulsive thinking. I think that's just fabulous. It's exactly spot on. And so the thing about the spark that you're pointing us to, Robert, is the other kind of pointing out. There's the pointing out of the details of samsara so we don't get lost in fantasy. But then after a certain point, and in the higher dharmas, there's pointing out means pointing out the nature of our mind. We could say our true nature or our Buddha nature, that it's not somewhere else. It's not like we have two minds. We have like a deluded mind, and then we have over there an enlightened mind. It's not like that. There's only one mind. And that mind can either be obscured or not. It can either be recognized, which is to say, recognized or not. Very often, there's a lot of language we'll talk about of being in the zone. A lot of extreme sports people will talk about this. Musicians talk about it. Artists talk about it. There's a lot of ways of getting into the now. But the thing about all these making love, I mean, there's so many things that we do, right? To, like we say, like nourish ourselves, to be present. And we are present during those times, and they're so fabulous. But the thing about them is they always pass. And so then we have to do it again, whatever our thing is that gets us into the zone. Then we have to keep doing it. Because this critical step isn't taken. The critical step of recognizing, of registering unconstructed presence. We're not seeing through our concepts or our feelings. Thoughts are arising, feelings are arising, but we're not seeing through them. So you're watching that fire and seeing those sparks. You say a glimpse. But consider that that glimpse may be beyond precious. But then, so then we want to relax into the glimpse, into the moment, with cognizance, seeing that there's nothing to see. Everything's too immediate. There's no there different than here. Sometimes it's talked about this phrase, Buddha in the palm. The Buddha is in the palm of my hand, not somewhere else. There's one mind which we can either recognize or not. When we don't, we call that ignorance. This is the first link in dependent origination. This is the linchpin. Without that linchpin, we're out of samsara, like in a glimpse like you're talking about. In that instant presence, is there anything missing? Can anything be improved? Or is it just perfect as it is? And maybe it lasts as long as a heartbeat. But that's the thing. That's enough. And then the only challenge is, can we relax into it? Can we rest without active mind? There's action, which is really a definition of karma. Karma is action, cause and effect. The translation of karma is action, acting, cogitating. Or can we rest in non-action, non-doing? But a non-doing, an open, empty openness that's lucid. So it's also possible to get into a chill space that's very peaceful, very quiet, but kind of dull, not lucid. That's a kind of samatha. It can be really lovely, peaceful. Nothing wrong with it. Everything right with it. Given how hyped up we are, how jacked up we are on our stimulants, our devices, being in a calm space is a reprieve, is a super nourishment. And it puts us in an optimal position to be able then to recognize instantaneous presence when it happens.
And this is Mark.
Ooh, trippy. Say that again. You kind of went wah, 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 wah.
Hi, sorry, we're using two computers. I got a little mixed up. Ken, this is Marcia, and I had a question about an experience that I had when I was on retreat. And it was a very momentary thing, but one of the teachers was a Nalio, and I was practicing with noticing the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. That was kind of the practice I was working with. And I had this instance where I tripped and fell. And in that moment, I realized that I was there was no greed, hatred, or delusion in that moment. And it was an amazing feeling and experience. But I could kind of only refer to it when I reflected back on it, rather than, in the moment, it was something, but there was no kind of definition until afterwards. Is that kind of typical of something, an experience like that?
Well, that's interesting because it has occurred to me that this moment of vision, a moment of vision, which is the shift from the path of the samsaric life, the transmigrating the path of sentient beings, to having a moment of vision where you shift from the mundane path to the noble path. And so, again, once that happens, beyond doubt, it's permanent. This is like the only thing that I'm aware of in the Dharma that's talked about sometimes as permanent, meaning that you're on now the path of the Arahat. You're on the path where you're going to be free from greed, hatred, and delusion. You're guaranteed. It may take a while. The maximum of 7, well, we say 7 lifetimes. But but actually it's 7 called bhavas, becomings. And so you can have a bhava, can have many jatis, many lifetimes, many births, can happen in what we call like a human, if you get it like a human incarnation, a human dimension, you can have many lifetimes before you exhaust your karma for that. Which is different than becoming a god. It's according to the, as people have said, the bhava is only one lifetime. It lasts a very long time. So sometimes what I talk about, which is similar to what you experience, is the moment of vision can happen. It's like when you're like going down steps and you miss a step, and there's that moment where you're aloft and you kind of like gasp, and you don't know where, and you're out of, and you're groundless, you're airborne, and that's kind of what it's like. So it's similar to what you experienced. And it left for you, the way that I'm getting what you said, it left an impression on your system. And so it was like wow. Okay, that's what I'm interpreting. Wow, what was that? So it was close, very close.
I was trying to think about last week because that talk was pretty incredible that you gave, because I felt like I was on some type of journey with you, and I came away with it. I think that you were saying that Merle here, sorry. I think you were saying that I am my projections. I think that's what you were saying. I'm still not for sure, but it was a start for me. Let's just say you did say that, where I was like, oh yeah, my lens, and then my story and my projections. And so I kind of played with that all week until you started this one up, just now. And I thought, it's I had we already talked about my last year was pretty intense, and I had this breakdown, which probably from trauma I heard kind of messes with your short-term memory. So I'm assuming since it stopped my, mess with my short-term memory, mess with my thought processes, I'm sure there was a chemical overdose in the brain, and that's kind of all starting to subside, but there's some other things like that are left as a residue, but I'm even not that. And so I in this state where I'm kind of manic, where I'm just like, you know, not totally hysterical anymore, but I did have like a moment because I did a trip the other day and I hadn't done it in a year, and I kind of got real riled up. And so I did kind of hysterical, but kind of like between laughing and suffering and, and me going, this is all just bizarre. And just, so I guess I'm observing now and my storyline. And, I could write a book, but now if I wrote a book, it would be a really bad idea because it would mean I'd be attached to it. And to be attached to that awful storyline would really be caught up in greed and delusion. Anyway, so it's very interesting to kind of start to mess around with it and then have also moments of like, oh, I can let go of all of this at any minute. But then yet I'm like, oh, I bet I gotta go pay a bill. I don't know. It's interesting for sure.
It's so important to respect that we exist in dimensions of mind, voice, and body, or mind, energy, and body. So when the system's really agitated, notice what's happening with your breathing, which links to subtle energy. The breath has direct connection to the prana. Direct connection to any sort of upwellings, like emotional upwellings, traumatic reactions or post-traumatic reactions, things that are loosening. I mean, trauma is extremely widespread, much more than we've been comfortable admitting. I mean, there's extraordinary trauma, like assaults and things of that nature that are, really heavy. And then there's ordinary traumas. Adolescence, sickness, the indignities of aging, and death, not only ours, but the people that we're close to. These are all traumatic. And we can only handle so much. And then the system protects itself. It's brilliant the way the system protects itself. Represses things. Dissociates. We can't handle it. So then time goes on and we get stronger, hopefully. And then it can come back up. And then we can digest what was indigestible earlier. And so that's where it's helpful, my feeling, to just pull out all the stops particularly during difficult times. And yes, sit on a cushion, attend to the mind, but also maybe also do some breathing, do some exercise, body, energy, and mind all together. Mainly with the energy, it's about letting the prana, letting the chi flow so it doesn't get stuck. And yes, mind is king, as the Buddha said. And ultimately, what we want to do is release on our projections. As it's talked about in psychology, is withdraw projections, which is fair. The only thing that bothers me about that is it seems like we have to do something to withdraw our projections rather than relax. with ourselves. Breathe deeply, inhabit our body, inhabit our feelings, inhabit everything. Breathe it in and exhale, breathe it out, let it go. So becoming closer to ourselves, befriending our difficult experience. Then the projections withdraw themselves. The kinder we can be. One of my teachers, a special one for me, Ruth Dennison, there's a mountain stream by the old fireplace, and there's photographs, with Scotch tape put up there. I want to put one of those, or maybe a better photograph in a frame. Anyway, Ruth Dennison, she has a fabulous life story, which we don't have time for right now. But this one facet of it, we do have time for. She was living in Sausalito along with Alan Watts and her husband Henry and the crowd early on when she first began teaching and by the way broke a rule, broke a vow. She was authorized to teach, but only women. Fortunately, she broke that rule. And so I was deeply benefited. But she was there at the end of Aldous Huxley's life. She was attending him at his deathbed. So I imagine, do you guys know who Aldous Huxley was? Some of you, he was an early, was a philosopher, a cutting edge philosopher, early explorer of psychedelics, particularly LSD and psilocybin. And he had a long and rich life. And so Ruth had the presence of mind to ask him at his deathbed, Aldous, what's your takeaway out of everything you've done, all the self-searching, all the inquiry, all the meditation, everything? What's it all come down to? And then he said, what I've learned is to be a little kinder to myself. Nothing fancier than that. There's two paths that follow two truths. The so-called mundane path, the relative path, is just this path of kindness. Because when we're really being kind to ourselves, we're not putting ourselves in a box, are we? Shoehorning ourselves into a tight space. No. We're letting ourselves be the being that we are. That's kind. Befriending the whole of us without making a deal out of any of it. This would be the wisdom part. So there's the compassion part, is the kindness. The wisdom part is we're not going to solidify anything. We're not going to fixate. We're not going to grasp. How do we do that? Not grasp, not react. It can't be done. That would be another activity. This is the great, magnificent paradox at the very heart of Buddhism. When the Buddha sat under the tree, he stopped practicing in the sense of having something to meditate on and trying to get somewhere, improve himself, which was his big thing, his ascetics. He was trying to, his self-improvement project was huge. He dropped it. And instead he said something like to himself, he did pose a question, what's true? Something like that. And then he opened himself to a listening presence, a welcoming presence. And in opening himself to what's true, everything came up. All the Maras came up and attacked. And he let them. But he didn't take away any of their energy. He didn't block, but he also didn't give them any energy. And that was when he had his awakening. Without ignoring what is, but without trying to improve anything. But listen to his own heart's deepest question. That's one way of talking about the great freedom. That there's nothing to improve. There's nothing to do. But this is the kicker. It's so hard for us to let go. Having something to do, of having a project. A project leads to a projection.
Never heard that.
Say again?
I never heard that one before. I liked it.
Yeah, babe. You know, the more you get into the Dharma, the more it makes sense. This is like an incredible thing. I've gotten into a lot of psychology and a lot of philosophy. I've kind of gone to the end of a lot of these things. Some very cool stuff. The Dharma, though, it just keeps getting more and more intricate. At the same time, it's becoming more and more simple. It's really weird. It's really beautiful and fun. Mental projections are cognitive projects that we're busying ourselves with. Of course, there's things we need to do. We have to pay bills. And we have to do things. But we can also notice, like, how much energy are we giving it? Are we just giving it, what it deserves, the bare minimum? Or are we getting all wound up over something or other? Well, we know the answer to that. We know the answer to that only because each of us has had the courage to look at themselves Or you might say, I don't know about courage, I was desperate. Well, that was me too. It's still much easier to open a bottle of booze than it is to sit on a zafu. So we know how out of control our mind can be. And we have not only the courage, but the wisdom to do something about it. So I think we'll need to leave it there. So included in that is this hour and a half we've just spent, where we could have been doing something else. Instead, we turned our mind to the Dharma. May we be blessed that the mind turns to the Dharma. May we be blessed so that the Dharma turns into the path. May we be blessed so the path dispels confusion. May we be blessed so that confusion dawns as wisdom. By the merit we've generated here today, may we obtain Buddhahood. May we obtain clarity and dispel the poisons in order to be of better help to others. From the ocean of samsara, with its stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, may all beings be free. May all beings be happy, have the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and its causes. May they never be parted from happiness, free from sorrow. May all beings rest and remain in great equanimity, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and real compassion.